neither NDI nor Mobile Active, or probably more Mobile Active than NDI, to talk about mobile technologies in elections and give you a sense of what's been happening vis-a-vis mobile phones in election observation and getting out the vote and mobilization, peer-to-peer activation, voter education information dissemination, and maybe other things that we're all going to talk about. What I like to do is kind of make this a future-forward panel. So our panelists, I'm not going to forget our virtual presence here. Our panelists are going to talk about some of the things that they've seen or done in elections so far. And then hopefully we can have a conversation about where this is all going. I think in a lot of the panels you've heard that mobile is the future. I certainly have believed that since 2005 when I started an organization called Mobile Active that focused on mobile tech and social change. And I continue to believe it and focus on it. And certainly in the countries that we work in NDI, Chris and I, it's often mobile first. And so having a mobile strategy in any kind of elections is critical. So without further ado, we're going to have opening remarks from our three panelists. James Long, who is at Harvard University, who conducted a really interesting study that he will talk more about in Afghanistan using mobile phones to deter election fraud. Then we're going to turn it over to Katrin Bracy, who was with the Obama Field Tech Office team in San Francisco, and was an integral part of the Obama mobile campaign and the conceptualization of their mobile app. And then finally, I'll turn it over to Chris Doten, who's my colleague at NDI on the NDI tech team, who will talk about some of the things that he has done in vis-a-vis mobile phones, SMS, and also now lots of other things, including IVR, interactive voice response and audio, in election protection, vote counting, and election monitoring and observation, as well as voter information campaigns. I'll give you a little bit of a sort of overview of what he's seeing that's interesting and noteworthy. And then we'll open it up to you all with the hope that we can talk about sort of what's next and where this is all going. So James, if I can have the slides. There we go. So James, we'll turn it over to you. And you can take it from here for about 5 or so to 7 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, great. Does the sound okay?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Okay, great. Thanks, Katrin, and thank you all for being here. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard and an assistant professor of political science at the University of Washington. In September of 2010, my colleagues from UC San Diego and I received a Development Innovation Ventures grant from USAID to develop and test a new election monitoring technology designed to reduce election fraud that relies on mobile phones. And in my presentation today, I'll first highlight what this technology is and does, as well as talk about future phases of the project and sort of seek your feedback on how best to improve it. So next slide. Fair elections are a cornerstone of democratic government, but many elections in new and fragile democracies suffer high levels of electoral fraud, and as a result, post-election violence. And as you all know, the U.S. and its allies spend a great deal of resources on shoring up elections in these countries, funding organizations like NDI to monitor and evaluate electoral processes and outcomes. So for example, this is always an interesting data point that I like to throw out. The international community spent over $250 million to support Afghanistan's 2009 presidential election. And that money was just the money that was spent actually on election day for the administration of, that one day and everything it entailed. It didn't involve all the sort of monitoring that went into the election. Just running that election took over $250 million from the international community. So given this investment, there's much to be gained from using proven, cost-effective, and scientifically rigorous technologies to detect and reduce fraud. And we set out to address that need with a solution that was in part a simple behavioral intervention and in part a scalable photo-based technology. We tested it through randomized control trials. Next slide. So what we did in Afghanistan is we started with a large sample of polling stations 471 from Afghanistan, which represent about 8% of those that operated on election day. Now, given security and logistical concerns, we could not visit polling stations in all regions of the country. So instead, we drew a random sample of stations within 19 provincial capitals, and Afghanistan has a total of 34 provinces. So while this sample lacks kind of national representativity, it does include the conflict-affected areas of the east and the south, which you should be able to see on the map, where the Taliban insurgency remains strong. Once we had this sample, we then sent local observers to deliver a letter to polling station managers on election day and during voting in half of our selected polling stations. The letter states that local observers will photograph that station's final vote count, which polling station managers must by law publicly post. The other half of the stations in the sample did not receive a letter. Next slide. The observers then returned after the polls closed with digital cameras to take photographs of these paper tallies at both the stations that received the letter and those that did not. And by measuring different kinds of possible fraud in the treated and control stations, we can document how the announcement of monitoring affects electoral quality. Next slide. Our results are extremely promising. Data from the 471 polling centers in Afghanistan show that the letter's announcement of monitoring reduced the theft of tallies and ballot boxes by 60% and fraudulent votes for the most politically powerful candidate by 25%. Next slide. Building from this initial success, Qualcomm Incorporated partnered with our team to scale up the project for Uganda's 2011 election. And rather than rely on digital cameras as we had done in Afghanistan, Qualcomm engineered a smartphone application that we deployed with HTC smartphones with our team of Ugandan observers. And in this project, we were able to visit 1,002 polling stations and a nationwide sample hitting all regions of the country, including the conflict-affected north. And we again found, like we did in Afghanistan, strong evidence that the letter caused a clear reduction in the theft of election materials and even stronger reductions in other forensic fraud measures. Next slide. Now, we developed this monitoring technology with the explicit goal of scaling it up and spreading it through viral adoption and crowdsourced implementation. In addition to professional researchers that we've trained, we aim to include networks of civil society groups and citizen activists. And we believe that using smartphones to monitor elections holds many advantages over current approaches. First, photographic records of vote tallies possess improvements over typical parallel vote tabulations recorded via pen and paper or even SMS, since they are free from recording errors or otherwise incorrect vote counts. Second, smartphones have the ability to geolocate and timestamp all data that is transmitted, improving the transparency and accountability of monitors themselves. Third, rapid data transmission allows for better crowdsourcing and presentation of real-time data. And fourth, smartphones provide a conduit by which viral adoption is possible to greater citizen participation in corruption monitoring around election, but also in other sectors in developing democracies. Next slide. However, mobile technology on its own is not a panacea for curing fraudulent elections. While new technologies have generated energy in the field of democracy and governance, we must be careful to acknowledge the limits of this technology. First, although citizens frequently use cell phones and increasingly smartphones, the activities I described would, at least in the short term, still require coordination among civil society and citizen monitors to properly use our monitoring approach. And this suggests to me that international involvement in partnering with local democracy activists is still vital for election monitoring. And in fact, NDI has been at the forefront of working to build capacity with civil society groups to monitor elections. Adoption of our technology cannot happen overnight or without continued financial and logistical support, and it's just one component of the range of activities that international and domestic monitors conduct. Second, although much of the latest work on corruption monitoring in developing countries tries to harness the power of citizen activism and engagement, we shouldn't necessarily assume that citizens are always the best source to monitor or sanction corrupt agents. We simply do not know whether the announcement of monitoring by citizens versus domestic civil society and/or international observers provides a more credible threat against misbehavior. And the answer here may be contextual. In some societies, citizens may prove more effective at monitoring, while in others they prove less effective. To address this challenge, we are designing ways to field test these alternatives in future waves of our project. And our hope is that citizens will provide an important component of the implementation and scaling of our technology, but we must scientifically test this to know for sure. We can't just assume that citizens are always the best monitors. Third, assuming that citizens could play a monitoring role, there is little research in the social sciences to suggest who among the population are likely to serve as pro-democracy activists and corruption monitors. Obviously, not all Egyptians have taken to Tahrir Square, and not all citizens in a country may necessarily be interested in corruption or even voting. So we want to answer, what are the social, economic, and political characteristics of citizens who would adopt our technology, and how do we find ways to reach them in the larger population? So in future waves of our project, we have designed ways to rigorously measure citizen uptake and adoption. But currently, many innovations that rely on citizen participation and viral adoption actually lack this information. Next slide. If we can address and overcome these challenges, we believe our methods could scale to every cell phone owning voting citizen in any country willing to monitor an election. We envision our technology as a new tool for citizens to hold their governments accountable through free and fair elections. But we recognize its limitations, and I look forward to hearing your ideas on how best we can move forward on further improving our monitoring technology. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was great. But we definitely at NDI want to work with you. So there's a lot of potential, particularly looking at randomized control trials and systematically assessing and using hybrid election observation and citizen reporting methods, which we're keenly interested in. Next up is Katrin, Bracy, who is a total personal hero of mine, who literally gave up months and months and months of her life to work for Obama for America.
17 months to be exact.
17 months to be exact, on a volunteer basis.
No.
Oh, no, you weren't paid. Okay, I'm glad.
It was probably even out to about $1.13 an hour. But,
okay, so giving up her personal life and her financial future for Obama for America, and working in a variety of capacities, first in Chicago and then in San Francisco. And you'll tell us all about mobile strategies, peer-to-peer, getting out the vote, and other good things Obama cooked up.
Yeah. Obviously, we are working in a different context than, James and Chris. So I feel a little bit unqualified to be talking about this stuff here. But our mobile strategy was really focused around mobilization and getting our supporters to take action. And we had the great benefit of being able to start with a blank slate. So mobile, if you can think back this far, in 2008 was a completely different animal. And so much of the stuff that we take for granted now wasn't even conceived of in 2008. And I believe we had an app in 2008. I don't think very many people used it. It was obviously just for the iPhone. I think the first iPhone came out in like 2007. So it just wasn't something that we had prioritized. I think the most we had, which at the time was groundbreaking, a SMS program. So I found out about Joe Biden at 3 a.m. along with everyone else getting a text message from the president in the middle of the night. And that was about the extent of it in 2008. So this time around, we started out early knowing that mobile was going to be at the center of our tech strategy, and needed to figure out how we could make a holistic mobile strategy, not just an app, but thinking about how people use their phones, where they are when they're using them, who they are. This was a bunch of the tech team in Chicago was a bunch of startup guys. And they had a lot of experience building apps for themselves. That's not who we needed to reach with our mobile app and with our mobile strategy. So we had to think about who our users were, how sophisticated they were with mobile technology, and where they were going to be and what action they were most likely to take in that time when we could reach them. So to that end, we had a comprehensive kind of tool set, starting with our responsive website, which don't know how many of you guys know what that means, but it basically means that on a web browser on your phone, the website will size down to fit the phone. So you're not like scrolling across the screen to see the whole thing. And it wasn't a mobile website, but it just kind of reordered the content. So it was easier to consume on a mobile device, and it would do that for a tablet or a phone, regardless of the size of the screen. We did have an SMS program that we made more robust. We have a new tool in our financial kit now called Quick Donate, which is basically saved payment information. So I don't know how many of you have donated to a political campaign before, but you have to fill out a really long and annoying form every time because the FEC requires all that information. And we built a system that allowed users to save that information and then just click a button or click a link in an email to give down the road. And we made an SMS version of this, so even before the FEC started allowing text to give, we had kind of found this loophole where if people had signed up for Quick Donate, they could text a number back to us and we would charge their card automatically. Then when text to give rolled out, we were on it like a week after the FEC announced that it was going to be legal. So you just text give to 62262 and you give $10, just like the Red Cross does. And then, of course, we had other kind of notification type stuff that we sent out via text as well. And then, of course, the app, which we spent a lot of time thinking about what it needed to be. And our big goal, the overarching mission for the app, was to make sure that it was encouraging people to take action. So it included, and it needed to be local and relevant to where they were to the extent that we could. So we had local events. We had local talking points, for lack of a better word, but kind of accomplishments. We had a Quick Donate built into the app. We had an action center which allowed people to canvas. So you'd open the app and it would show you 50 or so houses and you're close to where you were that you could go knock doors. And the beauty of this, which the field organizers loved, and this was actually did not exist in '08, is that synced directly back to the voter file. So you could have volunteers walking with a paper list and a clipboard and volunteers walking on their own with the mobile app, and all of that data was syncing to the same place in real time. And you could also register voters on the phone. We had an online voter registration tool called Gotta Register, which we did a lot of mobile voter registrations with that. And I think that's it. But we were really, I had dinner last night with a deputy field director from Colorado who said that some of his regions in Colorado were strictly using mobile canvassing as opposed to the lists, which we thought was a great win, not just for the environment, but because of the data integrity. Having to take all those lists at the end of the day and enter them into a computer is a pain, as you can imagine. We actually found, though, that canvassing with iPads did not work that well, which I found interesting, and we scrapped that. We had an experiment to test getting rid of clipboards altogether and using iPads instead. And I just think people were a little bit, it got in the way of having a conversation that for some reason didn't happen with the phone. The other thing we thought about integrating and actually didn't, it seems like it should be an obvious thing to have in a mobile app, was our call tool. But in order to do the data entry that was required, you'd have to have a headset, or else you were talking and then looking down at your phone and entering information and then putting the phone back up to your ear. So it ended up being a big user experience issue. So we left the call tool out of our mobile strategy. And then there were a few things that we wanted to integrate that we didn't get to, and maybe, I would say someone should do this for 2016, but I'm sure we'll all have chips embedded in our heads by then and mobile phones won't exist. But we built a Square. Do you guys know what Square is? It's a little thing you plug into the top of your phone and it swipes credit cards. We built an app that was FEC compliant, so that we could take donations using Square. And it never went beyond the field office, which was kind of a bummer. We just didn't have the resources to support building it out. And then we also thought about doing GroupMe integration. So GroupMe is this group texting service. And for groups that go out together to canvas and then split their lists, we thought that would be a good way for them to just stay in touch with each other as they were canvassing. And that was something that kind of fell off that we didn't get to integrate, but I think could have been really cool. And the other thing would have been more robust localization. So by the end of the campaign, we had cleaned up a bunch of the recovery data to show where recovery projects were mapped by zip code and how many jobs they created or saved. And we wanted to use that on mobile device, and we launched it online. So, I mean, in theory, someone could have used it on the responsive website on their phone, but we wanted to build it into the app in a way that would allow people, sitting at their 4th of July barbecue with their crazy conservative uncle to like hold up the phone and say, remember, your job was saved because of the president, that kind of thing. And we never got around to it. But we saw, most of the data I have on how successful it was is anecdotal at this point. But, we had in the middle 6 figures of downloads for the app. We saw a lot of activity on canvassing, like I said, with our team in Colorado working solely on the app in some regions. So, obviously this is something that is not going away, and we are, breaking down that barrier between, tech, your desktop, your laptop, and your phone. Like that experience needs to be the same, essentially, considering especially the voters we were trying to reach. 18 to 29, of 18 to 29-year-olds, half of them we could not reach through our traditional means. They wouldn't have gotten a phone call from us. We did a lot of work to reach them via social networks, and we're really successful at it. But part of that outreach has got to be mobile, and we're going to put a lot of effort into that, into whatever OFA becomes in the coming months, and I'm sure in future Democratic races.
Thank you so much. I'm just back from Uganda last night, actually, and the demographics there are absolutely staggering. 80% of the population is under 38, 50% is under 15, and with internet penetration there, which is very limited, mobile is absolutely the way to go. And so I think what we're seeing is, there's an interesting sort of similar demographic between a much younger set of people who are completely comfortable and familiar with mobile devices and do all sorts of, funky things that the sort of over 38 crowd probably can't even envision.
Actually, funny story. I was walking onto the train yesterday, and some kids who were maybe 13 were 2 girls. They seemed to be fighting, and their friends were standing around looking not very concerned at all. And there were some older women who were crossing the street at the same time as I did, and one of them went over to the kids to see what was going on, and they're like, "Oh, we were just faking and videoing it, and we're just going to upload it to YouTube." Like, okay.
Yeah, or my daughter who literally takes phones with her mobile on anything that she shops. She sends it to her friends before she makes a purchasing decision, right? She literally has her own little focus group via her mobile device. I mean, these are things that I wouldn't necessarily think about when I'm in the mall. But so turning it over to Chris. Chris is working actually right now as we speak on the Ghana election, which is coming up on Tuesday. NDI is also involved in the Kenya election, the Lebanon election, the Uganda by-election next year, and I'm sure many other elections in between. So I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us a little bit more about what you've seen from an NDI perspective, what is interesting in mobiles in election in particular, and where you see this all going.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to focus during this time a little bit on how these guys end up bridging the gap between normal people's experiences and hard data. And I'd argue for any kind of election work, whether we're monitoring it, whether you're running a campaign, it's all about data. It's not about anecdotes. And so for most elections, we're working with nonpartisan civil society community groups to build confidence of the people of that country in the election process, and often a very charged environment. It's an election. And the real adversary is often the fast-moving rumors on the street. Those kill people. It's not the election commission per se, although there's some that are better than others. And so you fight these kinds of problems with like hard data from a credible source. And we find that mobiles are indispensable in that sort of process. So all of this is just predicated on the ubiquity of the simple phone, which gets, I think, unfairly called a dumb phone these days. But, you know, revolutionary. You got a universal communication device in the pockets of almost everybody in the world, and that's changed the game for a lot of things in the world of democracy, in the world of international development, and particularly for election monitoring. So, first place we got to play with this was Montenegro in 2006, and the kind of election monitoring that NDI supports with our partner organizations ends up trying to gather structured data about the conduct of an election, both the process and then the results at the end of the day. So draw a little bit of a distinction with what James did with the taking a photo of the end results. That's absolutely critically important, and it's the pictures are a very clever innovation in how to capture that data accurately and easily. But we'll also make sure that the partner organizations are throughout the day observing the whole process. So, you know, things like, did the fingers get inked as well as what are the final numbers at the end of the day? So SMSs would then get sent in throughout the course of the day with this information to some short code, generally processed, analyzed in an online database, and then being reported back out to the world. And there's a real need for speed in this sort of process as independent civil society groups, because generally, you got to beat the election commission. And, you know, like I said, they're not the bad guy. But in some countries, we find it maybe clarifies their thinking a little bit to know that there is an independent, credible civil society organization that has some hard numbers and hard facts in hand. And we'll just hang on to that and then hopefully not have to say anything about it until they come out with their results and we can back them up and say, that's absolutely right. So SMS changed this process, which NDI has been doing probably since the get-go, 25 years ago, from a process that took days to one that takes minutes, although there are still exceptions. In the recent Georgian elections, we got every single data point except one. Where were you? I had to get a horse and I couldn't find a horse. So there are some places where SMS still doesn't work. But it's not just collecting the information, it's also a way of communicating back out to people. Again, in the Georgia election, there was a concern throughout the day that polling places were so crowded that there was chaos, and maybe this would lead to manipulation. Well, we could text a question out during the process, get that answered and fed back into the system, and kind of dynamically recalibrate to face the challenges that the election actually was, that the people were concerned about. The problem with this is it's super complex. With the Ghana election that I'll be out there for next week, the simplest message that an observer could send in would be PS 441503AA1. At the end of the day, the results messages might be 60 or more characters long of this gibberish. That's really hard. That kind of limits participation. It adds a huge cost and complexity, and so you can't have that many people doing that sort of thing. So, you know, I think it's absolutely right that kind of the model that James articulated, where they're working with some trained observers now or with certain partner organizations, they hope to spread that through smartphones to other people. We see that very much as the future of election monitoring as well, because the processing power of these guys means that you've got some sort of actual computer in your hand, and you can take away complexity, you can abstract away the complexity and put it in here. You know, certainly we've moved a long way from literally cutting apart lists and handing them out to people to the printed lists, and now with the people you related in Colorado, they're able to do the data entry on the phones, reduce complexity, save time, and time is money for campaigns. For us, it enables large numbers of additional people to participate in this election monitoring process. So more data is better, but better data is even better than just more data. So this helps, we think, kind of smash the dichotomy between crowdsourced anecdotes and a limited number of high-quality trained observer reports. So if you put the right kind of app in people's hands, that can create the sort of structured data you can use to get, you know, kind of apples to apples comparisons across the board. and increase the participation of other people who are interested by lowering the barrier. You don't have to go to a 2-day training on how to send your Martian gibberish 60-character string back to the database. So, it also enables embedding rich media, telling stories through images, and so on, that can then be used to back up and bolster the actual hard data behind everything. It also can kind of help catch fraud where it's happening. These days, it's pretty much only the amateurs that try and steal elections at the ballot box. Most of the hard work in rigging elections goes in months ahead of time, manipulating voter lists or buying with administrative resources, that sort of thing. You can't do that. You can't pay enough people to be across the country for months to monitor that. Clever apps and distributed mobile smartphones and other devices help normal citizens participate in that process as well. So there's a lot of clever things that you can do with trying to prevent fraud, but there's more than that as well. The ability to communicate via these devices and push information to the voters as a whole is just prodigious. The popularity of texting your registration number, find out where you vote, those systems are incredibly powerful and very, very useful in a lot of countries around the world. Providing information about where to vote, how to vote, and so on. And then now that we have these things, we're generating data ourselves all the time. So there's a new form of information you can gather, mining sentiment analysis to see where in Kenya is there likely to be flare-ups and violence based on the kind of perhaps rumor mongering or other things that are going on. So you can get a lot of information that way. So. We're doing some new stuff with interactive voice response systems. We think of them as kind of voicemail hell, like when you call in your bank and try and deal with them, but they can be used for good instead of evil. So in Ghana, we're creating a series of short radio snippets, putting them on a server. Radio stations can call in, including in local languages, get that and redistribute it out to these audiences who will never be on Facebook during this election cycle. And so on. So there's a lot of challenges with this. Phones are hideously insecure, and for those who are working in closed societies, dangerous environments as human rights activists or democracy supporters, that's something that can be really challenging, and we have to deal with that in some interesting environments. But I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. We have a ton of time to engage in a conversation. So are there questions, thoughts, comments, the interesting things that you've seen? Tweet them, raise your hand, talk to us, ask questions. You first, and then you. And there's a runner right here. Right there? Yes? You got it.
So I have two questions. One you touched on a little bit at the end with respect to both security and privacy, and if there are kind of active efforts to address those that can be pushed out more broadly to groups. And my other question this morning, there was a speaker who mentioned kind of three aspects where tech can help: participation, administration, and trust and confidence. Most of the presentation that I heard so far seemed to be focused on both participation and administration. I wonder about sort of the public trust and confidence piece.
Chris, you want to take that?
Sure. So on the security front, it's a really big problem. The telecom companies are inevitably controlled directly or indirectly by the government in Syria. It's Assad's cousin, I think, who owns the cell phone provider. So it's something that NDI has to grapple with in a lot of places. Security and privacy are very much linked concepts. I think most of the lessons probably would apply elsewhere in the United States as well. It's something we're wrestling with. In some ways, it's a fundamentally unsolvable problem because networks, you have an eye, the bad guys, if you will, have an eye on the whole network. So you have to instead play games of trying to fly under the radar. Our standard methodology, which I described, of a short code, where people, 5,000 observers across the country text in, would last perhaps 45 seconds in a country like Zimbabwe. So we have to come up with other alternatives for that.
There's some interesting episodes or anecdotes, I should say, and very little data, unfortunately, to the degree of monitoring that is happening. In Uganda, again, and that's because I was just there, so I heard all the stories, during the last election, the 2011 election, and this was just after the Egyptian revolution, the government called all of the SMS gateway providers in and said, we have this new decree, you cannot use in any of your communications certain keywords. And in fact, certain keywords were blocked by the telcos at the behest of the Ugandan Communication Commission. Those included revolution, Egypt, square, other potentially insidious comments. Go ahead, James. Did you have a?
Tunisia was one of the words as well.
Oh, Tunisia was one of the words as well. And so, we tried to get some substantive data to that effect. What was the actual sort of censor rate there? And it's virtually impossible to acquire or get because the telcos will not give it to you. They are licensed by the state. And the state, in most countries, there's provisions that allow a communications commission for national security reasons or public order or whatever to impose some sort of restrictions. And SMS, in relation to SMS, it's also all sent in clear text. And so, somebody could easily decipher the kind of coding mechanism that we use if one were to be inclined. So, should we be using encrypted SMS? That's very complicated right now with mobile devices. It requires a certain sophistication of device, and there's very few applications available that are, solid in terms of user experience. And so, there's an excellent question that actually does not have a very good solution. Our reliance on mobile devices, so long as we do not use universal encryption of all mobile communications, peer-to-peer encryption, is really very much subject to monitoring and interception disturbance. To your second question, public trust. Does any one of you want to?
Can you say more about what you mean by that?
And James, chime in. Can you hear? Can you hear?
Yeah, I
right?
can hear.
So
Chime in if you need to. Okay.
when I think of trust and confidence, I think of both better informed voters so that they are more aware of issues, information about candidates, but also building transparency around the election so they can see what's going on, making the process more open or engaging, and using mobile devices to put that in people's hands, in addition to what sounded like quite reasonable benefits with respect to participation rates and kind of ease of administration.
Anybody want to take that on?
Well, I'll just say from our perspective, we have found that empowering our supporters builds trust. And so by giving them these tools where they are, that was just helpful. Like I said, we tried to provide as much local information as possible. So, this recovery map that we had big plans to incorporate into the mobile app was part of that. And, I don't know if anyone has worked with the recovery data set, but it's a nightmare. And it actually took a lot of work for us to clean it up and put it in that form, and that was a big, when we released that tool, it was big for us. But in terms of election day monitoring for us, I mean, obviously we don't have the issues, except maybe in Florida, that you guys deal with when it comes to trust. But we were using Ushahidi on election day for and not in a public way, but for our own kind of boiler room incident monitoring and in order to help us dispatch our lawyers. And
who was reporting to that, Matt?
We had poll watchers, and there were lawyers on the ground in the field, and if anything was going on in a systematic way, we could detect patterns from the stuff that was coming in from the field and decide whether we needed to, pursue legal action or whatever. So we got in on the Ushahidi game.
Well, so one thing I'd chime in with for the whole purpose really of the election monitoring efforts that NDI's partners do is to try and build that public trust and confidence in these highly contested elections, or if there is no confidence in the election, to forthrightly say that as well. Now, in most of the countries we work, it would be prohibitively expensive at the present time to try and inform people directly via mobile device. I can't blast text message everybody in Uganda. It just costs too much money. But so we end up we distribute in as many different ways as we can, but for many things the audience is not necessarily the public writ large, but the journalists and other people, community leaders, NGOs, and other groups who will then transmit that information down secondhand. So that we do have kind of more aggressive engagement strategies to reach out to those kind of communities who are more connected and are more able to be reached. But like the community radio, I guess, would be the kind of the best example of that. We can't reach directly somebody in Uganda speaking Tree, but we can put a small clip of news about the election in the hands of a community radio station that will reach them and tell them, if indeed this is what happens, that the election was well run, that things were calm, that any incidents of violence were deplorable but limited and did not affect the outcome.
I think the other thing, and then I'll get to your question very briefly, the other thing that systematic election observation as well as citizen reporting can contribute to is dispel rumors. You know, obviously mobile devices are also super great and useful for fast rumor dissemination, and in a very tense, often very tense election environment, rumors just run amok. And so having data and good data or somewhat reliable data, particularly through systematic monitors, but also through citizen reports, really can help in dispelling rumors about, you know, fraud, rigging, violence, et cetera, which is not always true and sometimes is used by opposition forces of whatever ilk to disturb elections. But you had a question.
Can I say just one more thing on the security and privacy piece while you're getting the mic? We ran into that too with our canvassing app, which is basically, I mean, if anyone's canvassed before, you get a list of people and, you know, addresses and ages and party persuasion or whatever. All that information was also in the mobile app, and we got huge pushback from some corners for doing that, and it was a little bit puzzling because it's all information that we give out to any volunteer that walks in a field office.
It's public data.
Yeah, you know, it's all from the voter file. So, you know, just the simple fact of it being available on a mobile app was somehow scary to people, which I just thought was an interesting anecdote. But.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about, and this is, we're going to see this in a lot of different ways, sorry, but there's a big difference between having to dig through like musty filing cabinets in the basement of City Hall and having things available at your fingertips. So I think our definitions of public data or whatever are going to be shifting.
Go ahead.
My question's really simple. It's for Katrin. Katrin, I didn't understand, and I'd like to understand, when you spoke about efforts and then experiential knowledge, giving up on certain efforts when you were to find that an iPad seemed to detract from conversation with a voter, but the phone didn't detract. And you said something like giving up on a headphone or giving up on, I guess you were meaning recording device.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
If you
explain.
could spell out what you really meant, it's interesting to me.
Yeah, so we have a tool. It's called the Call Tool.
What tool?
Call Tool, great name. Which basically just, I mean, it is the version of, you know, you go into a field office and get a list to call people. Those same lists were in a database that we put into this call tool. So you could just go to call.barackobama.com, select a list, or one would be pre-filled for you depending on where you are. And you just call those people from home. You don't need to go to a field office, and all that data is synced with what is actually happening offline in a field office. It made a lot of sense to us in theory that should be available in the mobile app. But when we went through some user experience tests, it became clear that requiring people to have a headset in order to use it was kind of a non-starter. So we never incorporated it into the mobile app. Though a lot of people, there's a picture of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's the chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee, using the call tool for the Wisconsin recall on her iPad. So I guess, we did get.
And the reason for why you needed a headset is because you enter data.
Yeah, so you're
while-
having a conversation with someone and needing to enter their responses during the conversation. So having to take it away from your ear and enter while you're in the middle of the conversation is awkward, to say the least.
That's a different, so that was
Well,
different.
at the door,
That
at the
was
door.
canvassing at the door, so explain how.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know how many you guys have iPads. You can imagine how awkward it is to stand at a door and try to type on an iPad while you're trying to have a conversation with someone. And it's just bigger and it's in the way. On a phone, it's just easier and more nimble for people to type that information. It's less intrusive. So
I know.
Yeah.
Everybody's
at the dinner
already like,
table,
"What?" Okay.
we haven't gotten to the point where we're iPadding at the dinner table yet.
And if you have any questions for James, please, he can hear you.
Sorry, this is another Katrin question.
Okay.
You've said app. I'm curious. Native app, web app. If native app, why not web app? Mobile web
And
app.
explain what either
So
is.
native just means that it's more deeply integrated with the phone's operating system. So we had, and it is possible to create what are called web views, where basically you're just mimicking, you're pulling into the app a web page from the mobile browser. So we did both actually in the app. So there were, most of it was native, but there were pieces of it that were just calling a web page into the app view. And then again, like I said, the website was responsive. So surfing to BarackObama.com from your mobile browser was going to also give you a mobile experience. And we were able to build the app faster than we would have otherwise because the website was already responsive. It was a lot easier to pull in web views. And the first versions that we put out were heavier on the web views.
Others? Françoise. And I have a question for James. So James, remind me to ask that if I.
Hi, I'm Françoise. I work at NDI, and I want to talk a little bit about Orca and sort of how Katrin, how you tested the web app that you guys used, and also Chris, how you guys might in the field test and have redundancies for when these things don't necessarily work.
So
And for those of you that do not know what Orca is,
give
want to
you the background.
explain what
Yeah,
Orca
I'm gonna tell you what Orca was. It's one of my favorite stories.
I'm sure it is.
But also, I'm going to make sure that Chris weighs in on this too, because many don't know that Chris was you an FO or an RFD?
No, I was just a lowly
Volunteer. Lowly, I mean, he was in the field in Colorado.
Not in his NDI capacity as an individual citizen.
Yeah, doing Get Out the Vote at the end. So that's actually where we met. So he'll probably have some good insights on that stuff too. But Orca was the app that the Republicans built that was supposed to be their election day reporting system. And they built it up. I mean, part of the reason this is a story is because they spent so much time building it up to be like the challenger to our system, which is called...
What does an orca eat? Yeah.
Yes, our system is called narwhal, and orcas are the only known predators to narwhals. So they named it Orca. Funny enough, it was not actually, it was like apples and oranges. Orca and narwhal were not competing tools at all. But Orca was essentially, and we had a tool that did do Orca, and it wasn't narwhal, which is kind of funny. But Orca was just what we call a scratch list. When a voter shows up to vote, they get crossed off the list, and we were sending that information back in real time so that we knew who had already voted, and more importantly, who hadn't voted yet. So that we could do GOTV to make sure they got out, and we were making
GOTV,
sure
get out
the vote, yeah, to make sure that they actually cast their ballot and we'd make a phone call or whatever. And Orca was the Republicans' version of that, and it crashed basically because they didn't test it at all. And really, I mean, I don't think it was a tech failure so much. We had a similar tool in 2008 called Houdini, and actually our tool this year was called Gordon because the guy who killed Houdini was named Gordon. But, and Houdini failed in 2008 as well in a similar way. But, the thing that was wrong with Orca is that it didn't understand how the field worked at all. Just the way they expected volunteers to use it, exposed this complete and utter lack of understanding about how organizing works and what it's like to be a volunteer at a polling location on election day. They clearly weren't doing any early vote GOTV because that would have been a perfect time to actually test the system, and they didn't use it. So it just was is kind of an utter all-around failure. It didn't actually lose the election for them. That was their candidate, but it certainly didn't help, and it certainly it put the lie to their constant ongoing kind of needling of us in the press about how they didn't think our systems were really all that. None of ours crashed on election day.
I tried to sign up for Orca repeatedly pre-election, and I'm not a voter, I'm not a citizen, so they couldn't have me pegged as a Democrat at all. Maybe they checked me out and saw that I wasn't a voter, but I volunteered in many campaigns, and I just could not get in. Nobody ever replied. The one time I got a link back to sign in, the link didn't work. So, I mean, clearly there were other issues of not just performance issue and load issues, but also their outreach and their just customer service just stank.
And I mean, the mobile piece of this is that it was people on their phones trying to send back information, and a lot of these people were in polling locations that didn't have Wi-Fi and didn't have 3G or 4G access, so they weren't able to use it. Even if it hadn't crashed, it was unusable, and they hadn't thought that stuff through. So yeah.
But so I mean, NDI does extensive simulations prior to an election to exactly test for that, to load test. And simulations are interesting because they often are catastrophic failures in the sense that every possible thing that could go wrong will go wrong or tends to go wrong. And that's really, really useful to have extensive simulations ahead of time so that all of these things get surfaced and unearthed, well in advance of the actual.
Don't tell our observers out in Ghana, but they all think that the simulation is about testing them. That's kind of true, but really mostly it's about testing the systems in a kind of a live fire sort of situation. We build historically perhaps a dozen different election monitoring tools a year to greater or lesser effect. Whenever you have a new set of developers, they haven't thought through the problems, and they don't necessarily scale. Nigeria last year, we had 8,000 people texting in 5 times a day. It's a lot of information to come in all at once when you've been trying it out from home, typing one message at a time. So we have to try and go through kind of exhaustive testing things. Also, the user experience kind of testing is something that ends up coming out of this. Like we're especially in a lot of the less developed countries in which we work, they're not highly sophisticated computer users. You usually have to evaluate a computer test. You have to have a computer test for somebody to be a data clerk, and a lot of people fail. So you have to have very simple user interfaces, and if you haven't developed those sorts of things, then your tool will not work because it's not developed for the audience who's actually going to be using it.
And the data center, just to explain, is the back end sort of big, huge room with dozens and dozens of computers where all of that incoming SMS data is parsed in the database, analyzed, visualized, pushed back out to the web in some cases, crunched to make sure that there's reliable information that is coming in, as well as, calling back those observers that you haven't heard from, et cetera. So there's a whole administrative kind of call center, data center back end that has very sophisticated sort of interfaces, data visualizations, looking at who has reported and who hasn't, et cetera. So that refers to that. Again, story from Uganda. There was a very, very clever guy who also happens to be the main IT guy for Parliament, who runs on the side a little tech company, which many people tend to do, have multiple jobs. And he developed a very, very useful little app that would allow Ugandan citizens to punch in their voter registration number or the number that they got from their voting paper to get their closest polling location. And somehow the whole thing went viral. There was a short code. And so he got, I think in the advent of the few days before the election, he got something like 10,000 people an hour texting in and wanting their polling location. And then on election day, when literally millions of people were trying to find out whether they should vote, the entire thing completely collapsed. the mobile operator wasn't prepared for that kind of volume. Their databases weren't prepared for that kind of volume. And just, it was great. It was a great idea. And hopefully many of the 10,000 people ahead of the election got their information. The whole thing completely died on election day. So load testing, and you can't really load test that kind of thing until election day comes around, but doing your utmost to sort of really beat the shit out of whatever application you're doing on election day, when really, everything is on that one day, is critically important. So I have a question for you, James. So the data that is coming in on the pictures, right, is parsed how? So when our election observers, NDI election observers, sent in data, it's in a structured SMS format, right? The thing that Chris was saying, right? There's one for the polling station, for your number as an observer. There's, the election result or some coding system that talks about the conduct of the election. So when I take a picture of the election result, how does that get parsed on the back end so that I could, as a data center manager, in the end actually have a sense of the actual numbers?
Yeah, so the way we did it in Uganda wasn't terribly efficient because we just had the data package and the photos sent to a Gmail account that basically got all of these. The one thing I'll say on security is that it's easy to shut down SMS shortcodes, but they can't go through data packages or emails or things like that. So I think revolutionizing with smartphones is a way to get around the issue of the ability to shut down SMS. But anyway, so we sent the tallies and the data basically just as files to a Gmail account, and so we didn't have the ability to quickly do anything on the back end. But we're innovating that part of it in two ways. One is there are various companies that do this now, and I'm not working on this component of it, but that are able to basically manually code off of a photograph very, very quickly, sort of different fields of data. So you would take a picture of a tally that had a particular section of it dedicated to the polling center code and the leading party's vote share and the opposition party's vote share. A computer can quickly sort of scan that and pull it out into a flat data file. So that's one thing that we're doing with the pictures. The second thing we're doing is we have a survey app embedded in the normal app that's taking the photos, where we're having people key in the totals as well as take the photos. So the keyed in totals would come in kind of like a traditional PBT done via SMS, and that would immediately go up, and then we could use the photos to verify. But that might help us get the data a bit faster.
I know of a company called Captricity that's coming out of UC Berkeley.
Yes.
that is
yeah,
parsing.
Yeah, that's the one we were talking about.
Oh, okay. So you're trying. Okay, it's worth checking out. It's actually interesting. Company that allows data parsing of image or paper, actually, image files or paper. Good. That's really super helpful. Other questions, thoughts, comments, new ideas, things that you think should be done? Particularly in the pre-election period, as we're struggling with that, sort of voter audits and other things, like where does mobile fit in there? Maybe, Katrin, you guys did stuff around sort of the voter protection piece. But as Chris was saying, only the amateurs at this point try to rig the election at the polling station. We actually have an effect with all of our presence there. Go ahead.
So, Chris, you mentioned that you do multiple apps for different elections, and that it sounded like you do a lot of ground-up development. Is there not reusability between these apps, and if not, why?
Great question, one that we wrestle with.
As we speak.
There's a couple different answers to it, but one is that we're there to do a job and help our partners verify, speak to the credibility of an election. But we're also there as an international development firm, and we're concerned about long-term sustainability. We're concerned about building capacity with our partners so they can work more effectively over time. And we would rather dump money into some sharp young local developers who are kind of doing some clever stuff and get them off the ground and help them create something that's localized to their context, because we know they're going to be there in a year and we're not. So there are reasons to do it that way. At the same time, reinventing the wheel a dozen times a year gets a little bit ludicrous. So it's a tension that we wrestle with. There's strong arguments on either side. As this gets, in some ways, to be more of a solved problem, we're moving more in the direction of reusable tools.
And so we're working right now on a sort of tech for them suite of tools that can be reused in country by country that sort of does 80% of what needs to be done with ability to customize and localize. And so PVT in a box is our first, PVT being parallel vote tabulation, what James and Chris were talking about, when the election result is actually conveyed from a representative sample of polling stations. That will give you an indicator of the results of the election. And so having a platform that includes, SMS aggregators, a backend database, visualization tools, et cetera, that can be reused and localized to different languages and in different context of different countries. There's a lot of variability in some ways. There's, some countries allow two observers at a polling stations. Some have one polling stations but multiple polling rooms, and so you have to account for that sort of variability, but obviously that can be easily embedded in customizable code. So we're trying this out for the, drawing from both the code bases that we've already developed and the experience that we're, getting election by election by election to kind of come up with a PVT in a box for anybody to use. Others? Going forward, pre-election, anybody give us some good ideas about voter audits and mobile phones?
Hi, I'd like to ask if anyone has worked with, to try to combat vote buying. If you've worked with SMS or with a picture, maybe you, James, or maybe with an application. Sometimes, I'm from Latin America, and in Latin America, the people that actually sell their vote are not literate, so I think an app would be probably more difficult for them to use. So I don't know if maybe by pressing a number or with a picture, something more easy. Have you heard or worked with something like that? Thank you.
James, do you have any? James or Chris? Any? Did you hear the question?
Was this about the use of mobile phones and vote buying?
No. Are there any good ideas to use mobile phones to unearth or prevent or publicize vote buying mechanisms? Maybe you can speak.
Well, I can tell you that every time I do present this to annoying political scientists, they always comment that mobile phones actually could be used to strengthen vote buying, because what you could do as a corrupt candidate is when I buy off a voter, I have no way to monitor how they actually voted. But if they take a cell phone in with them and take a picture of the ballot, I can verify it that way. And then sort of, I give them one shoe before they go in, they take a picture of their vote, and I give them the second shoe when they come out. I think that's probably highly inefficient, because obviously you could just have a number of voters who all share one photograph, and I don't think politicians would necessarily know that. So I think there's even ways around that. But I do know that people are sort of worried actually about, we're all on the pro-democracy side of this, but people are actually worried about the systematic use of mobile phones to kind of undermine electoral processes. In terms of whether or not there would be a good app for vote buying, I don't know that there would be, and I don't know that it matters. If vote buying is technically illegal, I could see a real need to do it. But if somebody, I guess I don't know the real difference between promising someone a sack of rice or promising them a school in their neighborhood, or promising that their neighborhood or their community will do better if they vote for me, if that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, if we're talking purely about giving the Irish a bottle of whiskey on election day, and that's vote buying of that really pernicious nature, I could see trying to address it. But I think in general, in terms of electoral administration, I'm not sure that I think vote buying is the number one priority.
From an NDI perspective, this whole thing, sometimes categorized as abuse of administrative resources, is something that we see as the way that a lot of incumbents might manipulate the pre-election environment to their advantage, and it is a big, to our mind, I think, a considerable problem. And it's not amenable to the PVT solution of 1,000 people scattered across the country on election day. That's not going to get you the information about what happened in the months prior. And so wrestling with those sorts of things is exactly, it's a great question. And this is one where I think there really is some strength in the concept of crowdsourcing. The idea that if it is well known that this is illegal, and if there are secure, anonymous mechanisms where people can share their individual anecdotal experiences with being bribed, I guess, for their vote, then that can be used to kind of paint a picture or get at some of that information. We haven't, I don't know that we've done it particularly well yet. I think Transparency International has been playing with, I've seen them playing with some of that stuff in Georgia. It's a hard problem to solve, but it's, I think, in some ways the future of election protection.
The thing that Katie mentioned this morning from USAID, who actually has the portfolio on elections at this point, that her fear was that, particularly in countries like Kenya and other countries where mobile money and mobile payment services are ubiquitous, that vote buying becomes all the much easier and possibly anonymized. Sort of struck me because I don't quite think that's true, given that many countries also have these know your customer KYC requirements. If there are actually sort of systematic patterns, they're also much more easily traceable than, for example, cash would be. At the same time, you can hand out airtime, right? And little tiny cards. But I think the other thing about this is, and I've been personally really fascinating with this whole notion of kind of memes for political organizing, memes around sort of symbolism, really, around political movements and others. So, the kind of, we all are familiar with the purple finger meme, right, as a sort of sign of an election. But there's all these other very interesting political movements, too, that use symbols, colors, particular movements, et cetera, in both online and offline ways. And so I was thinking about that in terms of vote buying, whether there's obviously platforms like I Paid a Bribe and, where you can tweet or text or whatever, somehow report that somebody approached you for a bribe, police officer, whatever. But if there's a way to actually sort of have some sort of a public meme in a particular country about the vote buying is not okay kind of piece, I'd love to see it. I haven't seen it yet. And to some extent, that it sort of requires an upswell and a bottom up kind of, citizenry that says, not with me here. I'm not viable. It might just be this meme, the hands, like, no, I can't be bought, kind of thing. I don't know. I haven't seen it. If there's anything that you're aware of enough to see it, but Michelle, you had a thought, question, whatever.
Yeah, I'm Michelle. I work on the NDI elections team. I think part of the issue, I actually agree a little bit with James, and I agree with Chris. It's important. Vote buying is kind of a corruption issue, but it also has to be enforced to be effective. And that's what when we advise our partners is to talk about, okay, if it's going to be enforced, then how will that be enforced? And for us, a lot of that comes back to election day and the secrecy of the ballot, right? If you believe your vote's secret, you can take everyone's money, right? In Latin America, in fact, sometimes the message to the party should be, you guys are handing money out to everybody and they're all taking it and still voting the way they want to. Like, it's stop with the arms race, right? Like, I think part of it's not only dealing with the voters themselves, but also dealing with the people that are doing it and show them almost from an economic way that it doesn't make sense, right? Not that you want them to then, right? So it's
maybe the meme should be, I take your money, but I vote how I want.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, in some countries in Eastern Europe, there have been civic campaigns that say, take all the money and then vote your conscience, like vote how you want to vote, right? Your ballot is secret. And they've done campaigns around that. So I think
it assumes that there's trust in the process and that in fact the ballot is secret.
Yeah, no, it assumes that they do believe the ballot is secret. And so I think that just makes that part of election day that much more important and a bigger deal to monitor and to understand how that works.
There was an interesting campaign by the opposition party in Zambia where they had this rather kind of just droll series of ads with all of the leaders of the opposition party going like this. And with the slogan, don't kubeba, and I don't speak the local dialect, but apparently that basically means don't tell. It's like, go ahead, get the bag of rice, pick up the free petrol, and then go vote for us later because that's what you want to do anyway. And they did.
Can I say something on this very quickly?
Yeah, sure. Can you,
Yeah, so I have
can you guys up the volume a little bit on James? Back there in the tech room. Thank you.
I actually have a project on ballot secrecy from Ghana and Afghanistan with various co-authors, and we found, so actually using survey-based measures of whether or not people report violations of the secret ballot, and it was about 17% of people in an exit poll in Ghana from '08 reported it, and then about a third of respondents in a post-election survey in Afghanistan reported it. But there's two separate issues, right? So was your ballot violated by a corrupt agent who's trying to monitor your votes in an exchange relationship where he's offered you a bribe and he has to verify whether you've fulfilled your side of the bargain. But there's the second, just whether it's pure fraud, whether husbands are accompanying their wives into the voting booths, whether the voting screens aren't there, whether the secret ballot just in and of itself is being looked at by party agents or other sort of oppressive people in the voting station itself. To me, that's a much bigger problem than the former, which is, people want airtime and they're willing to sell their vote for airtime. That's probably a hard thing to do something about. Whereas people who are just not voting in environments that are conducive to the ballot being secret in that station while they're doing it, that is what I think that's something easier for us to focus on, because that's an election administration problem. And, there's lots of ways that we could increase that security. We could think of ways to, do a randomized audit of, filming polling stations, watching the process, having people sort of be, asking people before they go in or they come out, things like that. I think we can improve that much easier than the secret ballot violations that come from corruption and vote buying.
Cool. Thanks for that. You guys are very quiet on Twitter. Actually, everybody's really quiet on Twitter this afternoon.
I don't have a Twitter account, if that's believable.
Yeah, James, we were looking for it. It was very funny because everybody has their @ handle in the program. And last question, make it short. You standing between us and coffee.
Real quick,
for the jet lagged of us.
What's done to prevent, like if you're collecting information from SMS, how do you know that the person or that you're not getting flooded with agents who are not part of your process, who are providing that information?
Well, I guess I'll speak to the international side. That's another example of things that in practice we don't find to be much of a problem. It's just too time-consuming and difficult for an organization, in which case we would probably be talking about the government, to try and manipulate things in that way. There's much easier ways for them to try and suppress that sort of system rather than poisoning it in that fashion. That said, we do know where the messages come from. We tend to have good records of what the phone numbers for our observers are, and so and there's information that would be difficult for people to just randomly generate, and so. We haven't found it to be much of a problem, but there are some safeguards in place that could catch it and avoid it. Just kind of general data integrity is a huge issue for these sorts of things, so we have to be very careful about people just like making honest mistakes. So that would also tend to catch any more malicious sort of playing in the systems.
And we build into the databases kind of logical checks, for both the content of the data as well as checking the number that the information is coming from, et cetera. And we oversample on the PVTs. We tend to oversample.
Is there concern about securing the information of the people collecting your agents? If you have their phone numbers and their information?
In most countries, you have to register with the government to be an observer. So they've got your name and ID and photograph and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's
in most countries you also have to register your SIM card.
Yeah, there's a lot of
just crossed that threshold.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that when you try and that seem like they're plausible risks, but when you actually kind of go through the process, you find out that they're not so likely to be really the concerns. I would actually love to hear Katrin on this one, because I had any number of friends who were talking about the calling tool, say, and they'd say, well, Chris, how can that possibly be a good idea? I mean, Republicans could get into that, and they could call and say, I hate Obama, and hang up.
There was a guy who tried to organize that, actually, campaigns to get volunteers together to use the call tool. And I mean, depending on the list that's in the call tool, that is likely not to work out very well for them. Most of the people we were calling at the end were our supporters, and we just wanted to make sure they were planning to vote or had already voted. And having some crazy Tea Party person call them up and say, what? I mean, Obama's a Muslim or whatever is not, I don't know how that helps them that much. So, they can't just call anyone. The lists are constructed, it's a very thoughtful universe, as you know. I mean, the call lists are specific people that we want you to talk to. So that wasn't really a problem for us. They tried hard to dirty up our data, but they weren't very successful.
And I think that's a statement that's true for us in some cases as well. And, I mean, it is the rare country that lets accredited election observers in that is also, really intent of giving us a hard time, right? Usually when there's accredited observers, there is a intent to have an election that is fair and has integrity. There's a certain willingness to engage. So we are working in some countries that are much more oppressive in some ways, and so we are kind of increasing our checks there in those countries, and really are actually doing a lot to obscure traces, to not at all put our observers at risk, to ensure that the data cannot be tampered with, which is as simple as shutting down electricity in the data center. Right? And so there's a lot of ways in which we're trying to sort of make steps redundant and more secure. But it's an ongoing battle. It's a cat and mouse game in so many ways. So with that, we are sort of at time here. Thank you, James, from, where are you now, Boston, Cambridge?
I'm in Cambridge, and it's too cold to snow right now. So.
Oh, you're joking. Oh, God. And thank you to Katrin and to Chris, and thank you all very much. And if you have any questions, we'll stick around for the coffee break. So thanks all.